I'm Robert Page. I'm an emeritus professor at Arizona State University, and I'm going to be talking about honeybees and other species of bees as environmental engineers. The information that I'm going to be presenting came directly from chapter 3 of the book that's shown here, The Art of the Bee. If you want to know more about me, you can check me out on Wikipedia. Just check out Robert E. Page Jr. In other episodes of the different series associated with this YouTube channel, I present different elements of what is contained in Chapter 3. I'm going to be covering issues surrounding niches, what are niches, how are they constructed, etc. Environmental engineering has two components to it that are recognized. One is niche engineering, and the other is niche construction. And I will talk about the differences in those two as we move along. The concept of a niche is quite old. This is one that I learned when I was quite young from Dr. Seuss. This is his book, On Beyond Zebra. Here he's talking about a letter, one of his fictitious letters in his alphabet that goes beyond Z, on beyond zebra. And the letter is called N. N is the letter I use to spell nutches, who live in small caves known as niches for hutches. These nutches have troubles, the biggest of which, the fact that there are many more nutches than niches. Each nutch in a niche knows that some other nutch would like to move into his niche very much. So each nutch in a niche has to watch that small niche, or nutches who haven't got niches will snitch. And this was obviously something that he brought in from ecology. He obviously knew something about ecology and the concept of niches. And these little creatures are sitting here inside of these niches, which is spelt incorrectly in his poem. But each one is occupying its own space in its niche, holding it down. You have species that are packed in together, trying to fit into a niche, very reminiscent of how we look at species packing and whatnot in environments. The definition of niches, there's many of them. This is the one that's used the most. It's the Hutchinson niche. And this goes back to Evelyn Hutchinson in 1957. And this is the niche concept that I learned when I took ecology in 1973 as a biology undergraduate. In her definition of a niche, a niche is a combination of individual elements of an environment that define it as belonging to a given species. For example, this could be the available food and shelter, the species predators and competitors, etc. Over time, the population, the species, becomes adapted to its position in this hypervolume of environmental factors. So this is her view, is that out there in the environment, there's many things that affect organisms. And your niche is where you sit in this multi-dimensional space of all these different factors in your environment, which could be predators, it could be food sources, it might be temperature gradients. You found your niche inside of a certain temperature range, and others are in different temperature ranges. The diagram shows one way of looking at it. It doesn't. You think about a huge number of different axes that could exist when you're looking at this hypervolume niche in this concept. But here's three. The nitrogen content, the carbon content, and the phosphorus content of organisms that are either primary producers, like plants, invertebrates, like insects, or vertebrates, like us. And so you look at them and you look at what their composition is, and you can determine what they've been feeding on. So when you plot this out in this three-dimensional space, you find that the different types of organisms cluster in different places. And this is showing you that they occupy different niches with respect to the resources that they are taking in from the environment. Niche engineering is one component of environmental engineering. Niche engineering is when the activities of bees affect the reproduction and survival of others. So organisms that are acting in their environment in ways that are benefiting other organisms, they are engineering niches for other species or other populations. A good example of that is how bees re-engineered the landscape of planet Earth, which I talked about in the first of the series on this YouTube channel. That where over geological time they changed the face of the planet from one that was green and brown and devoid of colorful flowers into one where the landscape today is filled with beautiful flowers and colors, a very dramatic change. And along with that change also came changes in the niches of many of the species out there who were either herbivores or predators of herbivores. It changed the entire landscape and the niches of vast numbers of different species. This is also obvious when you look at the coevolution of plants and bees. About 125 million years ago, a big explosion happened with respect to colored plants, flowered plants. The angiosperms came onto the scene, and they very rapidly went through speciation and developed a whole huge assortment of different kinds of flower shapes and colors, etc. And associated with that was an explosion in the different numbers of species of bees and their specific properties. Their specific properties were fitting the flowers to which they had become adapted over time. Altogether, today we recognize more than 25,000 species of bees. Only 6% of those are social. And today we recognize about 350,000 plant species, of which 74 to 94% of those need pollinators, and most of those pollinators are bees. Some of the associations of bees and plants is very close and tight. We recognize different kinds of properties of bees. We call it monolectic, oligolectic, or polylectic, based on the different variety of pollens that they will accept, that they will harvest and live off of. Monolectic bees collect only one kind of pollen from one species of plant, or a very narrow set of species that are closely related. Oligolectic bees, they also only collect pollen from a very small, closely related set, but a little more diversity in what they'll accept than monolectic bees. Polylectic are like honeybees. Honeybees are polylectic. They'll go out and collect pollen from anything. They'll even collect pollen from pine trees. It doesn't matter. They're polylectic. So this is an example of the Pepinapis species, which is a specialist on squash plants. So it specializes only on squash and closely related cucurbit plants. Some specialize only on gourds. So you have the squash and gourd bees, which are very much specialists on the cucurbitae. Bees, over time, not only have re-engineered the planet on a geological scale, but they've also re-engineered agriculture as we know it. And this has taken place over the process of decades. You go out and you look at these big fields of monoculture plants, sunflowers, almonds, mustard, and the huge plantings of these different plants have very much altered the niches and altered the environment for different species that will be either depending upon the plants themselves or will be preying on insects that do depend on the plants. So there's a whole niche and whole ecosystem that evolved inside of these agricultural ecosystems. Bees, honeybees specifically, have re-engineered also the agricultural economy. This is now affecting us directly in that we use these resources. For example, when I was growing up as a kid in Bakersfield, California, in the southern part of the Central Valley, there were not very many almond orchards at that time. About 50 years ago, there started a big explosion of almonds throughout the Central Valley of California. more and more and more plantings of them. This came about in large effect by management practices of bees. The bees were very effective pollinators of almonds, and by having bees and commercial contracts with beekeepers to bring their hives in on trucks, we call it bees on wheels, they would drop them off in the orchards just for a very few weeks. They would pollinate the almonds, and when they started doing that, the yield of almonds increased dramatically in these fields. And as a consequence of the dramatic increase in almond production in the fields, you had a dramatic increase in the acreage of almonds that were being produced. Today, if you drive from Bakersfield or Red Bluff, California, it's a distance of about 640 kilometers from south to north, you will just see vast plantings of almonds. Overall in California today, there's more than 500,000 hectares. Now, my figures here are only a few years old, where I show 400,000 hectares of almonds, but now there's more than 500,000 hectares that are grown in California. There's 280 trees per hectare. That's 7,000 almonds per tree, 7.5 million flowers per hectare. And overall, there's 112 million trees in California on these 400,000 hectares. Almonds is a cash crop in California, valued more than $5 billion. There's a huge industry that's built up around it. Another fact is 3 trillion flowers and more than 750 million almonds come from this 400,000 hectares. To get the crops, the almond crops, it requires 6 hives of honeybees per hectare. Beekeepers bring these bees in. That's 2 million hives total throughout California that are needed just for the almond pollination. And that represents about 60 billion bees. So it's huge. It's a huge enterprise, and it expands in many directions. You eat an almond joy. It has an almond in it. You can eat these little almond Hershey Kisses. It's got an almond in it. Almonds are used in all kinds of cooking. When the almonds are harvested, they go and they have to be hulled and shelled. There's a whole other industry there. So there's a huge amount of industry that is contained within the almond production. And that represents human niches. That's part of our niche, our economic niche, the agricultural economic niche. Honeybees also affect agriculture through pollination of alfalfa. They're the primary pollinators of alfalfa plants in California. Alfalfa is grown for 2 reasons. It's grown and it's fed to cattle as feed, but it's also grown as seed. And seed production is very important and very much dependent upon honeybees. Honeybees and also their leafcutter bees, which are also used. But the honeybee is the primary pollinator of alfalfa. If you look at the impact of alfalfa field, an alfalfa field will produce about 2,000 kilograms of nectar per hectare. Now that nectar is the reward that they're offering to the bees to come and visit the flowers and pollinate. So that's the reward, and that's affecting the niches, of course, of the bees and many other insects that also collect or harvest nectar from these flowers. Bees aren't the only ones who collect nectar. You get about 13 kilograms of seed per hectare if you don't have bees in your field. You get 900 kilograms of seed per hectare if you have bees. So you can see that bees are critically important. The effect of bees on the agricultural niche expands beyond agriculture into other areas as well. So seed alfalfa is used to make hay. It's planted in the fields for feed. It's fed to the cows. The cows' leather, when the cows are processed for meat or whatever, it goes into shoes. So you got a whole industry of shoemaking. The the cows also produce milk, and the milk can be used to make ice cream, which can be sold at baseball games. So I mean, so you can see the spread of the influence. This is affecting a broad niche that is including humans. Africanized honeybees re-engineered the entire New World. It dramatically changed different environments. There were no honeybees in the New World prior to the mid-17th century, when bees were brought into the eastern part of our country. They were brought in from Europe. The bees that we brought in initially were all European bees, and they started spreading across the continent. And they spread very slowly. It took them 200 years to get to the Rocky Mountains. And the Rocky Mountains created a barrier to them they couldn't get over. They were actually transported by ship around South America and into San Francisco in the mid-1800s. So it was a very slow process as they spread across the country. This process of spreading occurred at a rate of about 11 kilometers per year. That's about the rate that they were moving across the continent. In South America, European honeybees were imported to Rio de Janeiro in the 1850s. And again, they were brought in from Europe. They were introduced in the area around Rio de Janeiro. And like always happens, the bees that were being kept in hives and managed escaped and became feral in the population, just like they did in North America. And they started spreading. This spread was very, very slow. It was only about 5 kilometers per year in South America compared to about 11 kilometers per year in North America. And that's because these European bees were not very well adapted to the environment in the warm, humid, tropical Brazil. And they weren't very productive as honey producers either. So in early 1950s, Professor Warwick Kerr was hired at the University of Sao Paulo in Piracicaba as an assistant professor. And he was given a job of improving the honeybee stocks to make them more well suited for tropical apiculture. So he went to Africa in 1956, and he went to the southern part of Africa, and he went around and he picked up some queens from colonies and brought them back to Brazil, back down to Rio Claro, where he had a bee lab facility set up. And his idea was that African bees, they're not European bees, but they're the same species. Okay, there's a different population. The African bees were not very desirable when it came to their defensive behavior. They're very defensive, and they weren't fun to keep as bees. The European bees were very gentle. They were fun to keep as bees, but they weren't very productive. His genetics training, he was a very well-known geneticist. He had done training in the U.S. with some very famous geneticists, but he also was trained in agronomy. And so he took a common practice in agronomy. It is to take two different varieties and you cross them and you make an F1, which was fairly uniform. It'll have all the traits, the dominant traits that were expressed in the two different varieties of plants. It was used primarily with plants. And then you cross those and you get your F2 generation. And the F2s, all those segregate. So you get everything mixed up in the F2s. And you go through and you select the ones that you want. And then you breed those to each other and you select out a new variety that will then have the traits that you want. So for example, there are a lot of brassica different brassica species of plants that provide a lot of the food that we put on our table. Cauliflower, turnips, radishes, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. Those are all brassica. So if you took something like a radish, and you eat the root of the radish, and then you take a cabbage, you eat the leaves of the cabbage. So if you could cross those and then make an F1 and then cross those and make an F2, you could go through and you could sort out, hypothetically, you could sort out the ones that have the leaves of the cabbage and the root of the radish, which is the eating part of the radish. Well, that was kind of the basic idea. But unfortunately, in this case, he ended up with the root of the cabbage and the leaves of the radish because these bees were very unmanageable. They were not at all good for agriculture at that point in time. So these bees, of course, escaped, and they started spreading across South America. They were moving north in South America at a rate of 350 kilometers per year. Huge increase in the rate of spread over what they observed in North America. The hybrids that were produced were incredibly adapted to the South American tropical and subtropical climate. So they spread very rapidly north. Today, there's estimated anywhere between 10 and 100 colonies per square kilometer throughout parts of South America, which is an enormous density of bees concentrated in South America, having huge impacts down there, widespread impacts. For example, the high density of feral colonies compete for limited resources with other insect species. And so there's so many of them that other species have to adjust. It restructured the bee industries. Every place it went, the beekeepers who had been there in the past stopped keeping bees because these bees were no fun. And then you had a new generation of beekeepers that came in who had never had European bees. They didn't know, what fun beekeeping was all about. All they knew was these African bees. And so they came in and filled the void of the older beekeepers. And the industry changed to one where beekeepers were looking for swarms, and they were building up swarms and making new colonies. And it changed the whole face of beekeeping in all the industries all the way up through Mexico. It hasn't had the same impact on North American beekeepers, at least not yet. It restructured the food niche of the Kayapo Indians. The Kayapo Indians are tribes that are located in the Amazon basin. And I had a friend who was an anthropologist who studied them. And he told me about the impact of the Africanized bees once they spread into that part of Brazil along the Amazon. These populations of Kayapo Indians, they had a very long and developed tradition in beekeeping, but they kept stingless bees. Stingless bees are close cousins of the honeybees, but they don't have a stinger. And there are 2,500 different species of these. They're social. They do make honey. And traditionally, these individual groups of Kayapos would have the beekeeper who had had the skills passed down to him by his father and his father's father, and they had a special relationship in that they were the ones who knew where the bees were. They could name all the different species of them, but they had their own names for them. But this went away when the Africanized bees came in. It changed the whole structure of how they harvested honey. They became robbers. Instead of culturing the bees, the stingless bees like they did, they became robbers of the Africanized bees. They would chop down big trees and cut into them so they could get the honey and the larvae which they use for protein, out of these trees. So it was a dramatic change in their niche. And also associated with the Africanized bees spread through the New World was an industry of new pest control strategies. So there was an increase in the total number of pest control companies, and they started specializing on bee removal. And it became a very lucrative enterprise. Also, as the bees moved through the Brazilian and South American, Central American habitats, they forced the repartitioning of niches of the native bees. As I said, there's vast number of species, of 25,000 species of bees, and there's nearly 2,500 species of stingless bees. But as the Africanized bees moved in and they were competing for those resources, the niches got repartitioned among the native bees in that they started foraging on other resources. If they were in competition, if the Africanized bees really liked one resource and they were really hitting it hard, then they would go to a different resource. The abundance of these different species changed over time. The relative, some were better at coping with the competition than were others, but it restructured the niches of these native bees.